The sacred mark doesn't choose outsiders, yet it just chose her. The air in the Shadowcrest Valley was thick with the scent of pine and the electric hum of the Blood Moon Festival. Ilara, a daughter of the rival Silverpaw pack, stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a diplomat's ward, a peace offering in a silk dress, meant to stand silent while the great alpha, Silas, touched the obsidian heart, a relic of the first wolf. But as Silas reached out, a rogue gust of wind sent Ilara stumbling forward. Her hand grazed the stone. The impact wasn't a touch, it was an explosion. A searing white gold light erupted from the relic, snaking up her arm and etching a crown of thorns and fire into her skin. The music died. 1,000 wolves dropped to their knees as Silas's golden eyes went wide with disbelief.
Welcome to Alpha King Romance Diaries, where passion meets power and love always reigns supreme. This channel is your escape into powerful love stories, deep emotions, and irresistible alpha energy. Hit subscribe and join the kingdom. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Stay tuned, the fun is just getting started.
The silence in the clearing was a physical weight, heavier than the mountain air. Ilara stared at her wrist, where the white gold light was slowly receding into her skin, leaving behind an intricate, glowing tattoo of thorns. It pulsed with a rhythmic warmth that matched her own frantic heartbeat. She was a Silverpaw, the blood of the enemy, yet the obsidian heart, the holiest relic of the Shadowcrest pack, had just claimed her. Across the sacred dais, Silas, the alpha of the Shadowcrest, stood frozen. His golden eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were wide with a shock that bordered on terror. To the thousands of wolves kneeling in the dirt, this was an impossibility, a desecration of their most sacred ritual. "I didn't mean to," Ilara whispered, her voice cracking in the absolute stillness. She clutched her arm, trying to cover the mark, but the glow shone through her fingers. She looked toward her own kin, the Silverpaw delegation. Their leader, Kale, had his hand on the hilt of his blade, his face a mask of predatory fury. To her people, Ilara was an outsider, raised in their nurseries but never fully accepted because of her late mother's mysterious origins. Now her own pack saw the mark as a theft, a Shadowcrest trick to steal a Silverpaw life for their dark rituals. The tension snapped when Silas stepped forward. "The mark hasn't appeared in 3 centuries, Silas said, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the stone floor. He didn't approach her with the violence she expected. Instead, he looked at her as if she were a ghost. "By the laws of the first wolf, this woman is no longer a guest. She is the Alpha's claim." "She is ours," Kale roared, stepping into the light of the torches. "You would use a diplomat's ward to spark a war. Return her, or we will paint these mountains red with your blood." The Shadowcrest warriors snarled, their eyes flashing as they prepared to shift. Ilara was caught in the center of a storm she hadn't asked for. In the eyes of the Shadowcrest, she was an intruder who had stolen their Alpha's destiny. In the eyes of the Silverpaws, she was a traitor whose very skin had turned against them. Silas reached out, his large hand hovering near her marked wrist. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from him was intense. "Take her to the high tower," he commanded his guards, his gaze never leaving Ilara's. "Protect her with your lives. If a single Silverpaw crosses the threshold, kill them." As Ilara was led away, she realized the peace treaty was dead. She was no longer a girl, she was a spark in a powder keg. The high tower was a spire of dark stone that overlooked the jagged peaks of the Shadowcrest territory. For Ilara, who was used to the rolling, sun-drenched tundras of the Silverpaw lands, the view was claustrophobic and terrifying. She paced the length of her room, the silk of her dress rustling against the cold floor. The mark on her wrist had settled into a dull, constant hum. It didn't hurt, but she felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the center of the keep, toward Silas. It was an instinct she didn't want, a biological tether to a man who was supposed to be her enemy. She had spent her life trying to prove her loyalty to the Silverpaws, enduring their cold shoulders and whispered insults about her tainted blood, only to be claimed by the very wolves they hated. A heavy knock sounded at the door, and Silas entered. He had discarded his ceremonial furs, wearing only a simple tunic that showed the scars of 100 battles across his arms. He looked weary. He walked to the window, staring out at the valley where the Silverpaw torches were gathered like an angry orange scar on the landscape. "They've sent a formal demand," he said without turning. "Your High Alpha believes I used a cloaking spell to force the relic to choose you. They want you returned by dawn, or they breach the border." "Then give me back," Alara said, moving toward him. "If I go back, the war stops. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them the stone is broken." Silas turned, his golden eyes narrowing. The air in the room grew thick with his alpha aura, making it hard for Alara to breathe. "The obsidian heart cannot be broken, and it does not make mistakes. That mark is a soul bond, Alara. To reject it is to invite a sickness that would rot both our spirits." He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the rug. He stopped just inches away, his presence overwhelming. "My elders are whispering that you are a spy. They want me to execute you to reset the relic's cycle." "And you," she asked, her heart hammering, "what do you want?" Silas reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was surprisingly tender, sending a jolt of electricity through her that made her knees weak. "I want to know why a Silverpaw girl makes my wolf want to howl at the moon for the first time in 10 years. He looked down at the glowing crown on her wrist. "That mark isn't a mistake, Alara, and neither are you. But until the blood fever passes, you stay here, under my protection." He left before she could respond, leaving her alone with a growing fear that her heart might betray her before her pack did. The following days were a blur of tension and restricted freedom. Silas refused to let Alara out of his sight, claiming that the hostility within the pack was too high. He brought her to his war councils, where she sat in the corner while grizzled generals argued for her death. She was forced to eat with him, to walk the ramparts with him, and even to stay in his study while he worked. Every time a Shadow Crest warrior looked at her, she saw the bared teeth and the narrowed eyes. They hated her presence. They saw her as a parasite feeding on their alpha's power. One afternoon, as they walked through the training grounds, a young warrior lunged at her with a training spear. "Thief!" he spat. Before the spear could even graze her silk sleeve, Silas had the boy by the throat, his eyes glowing a predatory yellow. The sheer power of the alpha's growl sent a wave of submissive terror through everyone in the yard. He didn't speak, he simply threw the warrior aside like a rag doll. Alara watched, trembling. "He protects her, but won't explain why," she heard a maid whisper as they passed. Silas didn't look at her, his jaw set in a hard line, but he moved closer, his shoulder brushing hers as if to shield her from the very air they breathed. The emotional tension between them was becoming a living thing. In the quiet moments of the evening, when the war councils were over and the keep was silent, they sat by the fire. Silas began to tell her stories of the pack, not the legends of war, but the quiet truths of their struggle to survive the harsh winters. He spoke of his own father's coldness and the burden of a crown he never asked for. Alara found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, the loneliness of being the Silverpaw's charity case, and her secret dreams of a life where her blood didn't define her value. The chemistry was undeniable, but it wasn't sexual. It was a deep emotional gravity. As she watched the firelight dance across the scars on his face, she realized he wasn't the monster her people had described. He was a man drowning in duty, just like her. But the peace was a lie. Late that night, a hawk from the Silverpaw lands arrived at her window, bearing a secret message tied to its leg. It was from Kale. "The Alpha uses your mark to track our movements. He is draining your life force to fuel his warriors. We strike at the new moon. Be ready to kill him or die with him." Alara looked at the message, then at the door where Silas's guard stood. Her trust, so newly formed, cracked like thin ice. The air in the pack's ancient archives was heavy with the scent of parchment and the damp stone of the mountain. Silas had granted Alara access to the historical vaults, perhaps as a gesture of trust, or perhaps because he hoped she would find the same answers he sought. She spent her hours poring over leather-bound tomes that crinkled under her touch, her glowing mark casting a pale amber light onto the faded ink. Every few minutes, she glanced at the hidden message from Kale tucked into her bodice. The paper felt like a brand against her skin, a constant reminder that her life was a countdown. It was in a scroll dated before the Great Schism that she found it. The text spoke of the Bridgebringer, a female born of one blood but marked by the spirit of another. "When the moon is swallowed by shadow and the two houses of the wolf stand upon the precipice of ash, the mark shall ignite. She shall not be a mate to the alpha of the wood, nor the alpha of the tundra, but the vessel through which the first wolf speaks. Her presence ends the war, or ensures the silence of the grave. Alara's breath hitched. The legend didn't say the mark was a gift. It described it as a volatile weapon. Silas entered the archives, his heavy footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceiling. He moved with less of his usual predatory grace and more of a weary slump. He sat at the table across from her, his golden eyes scanning the scroll she was reading. "You found the prophecy," he said, his voice a low vibration in the small space. "My elders have been reciting it since the night of the festival. Half of them think you are the savior. The other half think you are the vessel of our destruction." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The contact was electric, a surge of warmth that made the mark on her wrist pulse with a soft, steady light. "I don't care about the prophecy, Alara," he whispered. "I see a woman who has been treated as a pawn her entire life, just as I have. The mark didn't bring me an asset, it brought me someone who finally understands the weight of this world." For a moment, the betrayal pressure from Kale's note faded. Silas's gaze was filled with a raw, emotional gravity that felt more real than any pack politics. He wasn't using her, not yet. But as the shadows lengthened in the library, she couldn't help but wonder if his wolf was simply better at hiding its teeth than hers. The fragile peace between Alara and Silas shattered the following evening. While Silas was away inspecting the southern border, Alara found herself wandering the upper galleries of the keep. She was searching for a way to clear her head, but instead, she found herself standing above the great hall, looking down into the tactical war room. Silas had returned early. He was surrounded by his generals, their voices hushed but urgent as they hovered over a massive map of the valley. "The Silverpaws are massing at the Iron Pass," one general growled, pointing to a strategic bottleneck. "If we strike now, while they think we are still negotiating for the girl, we can wipe out their vanguard." Silas leaned over the table, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight. "No," he commanded. "We wait for the full moon. The girl's mark is reaching its peak. If we position her at the center of the defensive line, the relic's energy will act as a shield. Their silver won't be able to pierce our ranks." Alara's blood ran cold. Kale's note had been right. Silas wasn't protecting her because he cared. He was protecting her because she was a tactical advantage. He was planning to use her as a living shield, a piece of equipment to be placed on a board. The tenderness in the library, the stories of his father, the way he looked at her, it was all a calculated play to ensure she wouldn't run before the equipment was ready for use. She backed away from the gallery, her heart cold and hollow. The mark on her wrist felt like a shackle, a tether to a man who saw her only as a means to an end. She returned to her room and locked the door, her hands shaking as she pulled out the hawk's message. The misunderstanding was complete. In her mind, Silas was no longer the misunderstood leader, but the ultimate manipulator. She began to pack a small satchel, her mind set on the western gate. If she was going to be used as a weapon, she would rather it be by the pack that had at least claimed to be her family. As she prepared to flee, the first distant beat of a war drum echoed through the mountains. The Silverpaws weren't waiting for the new moon. The war had arrived. The drum beats were not just sound. They were a physical vibration that rattled the window panes of the high tower. Alara stood by the heavy oak door, her satchel gripped so tightly her knuckles were white. The betrayal she felt was a cold, sharp blade in her chest. She had almost let herself believe in him. She had almost let the warmth of his hand erase years of being an outsider. But hearing him discuss her as a shield had snapped the illusion. To Silas, she wasn't a soul bond. She was a battery for an ancient relic. She slipped out into the corridor, moving like a shadow. The keep was in a state of controlled chaos. Warriors were sprinting toward the armory, their armor clanking in the dimly lit halls. No one spared a glance for the Alpha's mark as she descended the back stairs toward the western postern gate. Every time her wrist brushed against the stone walls, the mark flared, reacting to her internal turmoil and the growing violence outside. It felt like it was trying to scream, a silent siren warning her that she was moving in the wrong direction. Just as she reached the heavy iron bars of the gate, a hand clamped around her arm. She spun, ready to strike, only to find herself staring into Silas's golden eyes. He looked frantic, his tunic splattered with the blood of a scout who had just delivered news of the breach. "Where are you going?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The Silverpaws have crossed the river. It's a slaughter out there." "I heard you, Silas," she hissed, wrenching her arm away. The mark on her wrist turned a violent, angry red. "I heard you talking about the defensive line. I heard you talking about using me as a shield. Cale was right. You didn't save me, you just harvested me." Silas's face went pale, a flicker of genuine pain crossing his features before it was replaced by the cold mask of leadership. "You don't understand the mechanics of the mark, Alara. I wasn't." "I understand that I'm a pawn to everyone," she screamed, her voice cracking. "My pack wants me back to save their pride, and you want to keep me to save your borders. No one wants me." She pushed past him, but the sound of the main gate splintering echoed through the courtyard. The Silverpaws hadn't just arrived, they were inside. The courtyard was a nightmare of silver and shadow. Cale had led a strike team through the subterranean tunnels, bypassing the main defenses. He stood atop a pile of rubble, his white wolf form partially shifted, snout elongated and claws dripping. "Give her up, Silas," Cale howled. "Give us the girl and the stone, or we burn this mountain to the roots." Silas stepped in front of Alara, his back to her, shielding her from the archers lining the walls. He didn't shift. He stood his ground as a man, his presence so commanding it forced a momentary lull in the fighting. "She is not a prize to be traded, Cale," Silas said, his voice surprisingly calm. He turned back to Alara, ignoring the chaos behind him. He took her hands in his, and for the first time he didn't use his alpha strength. He was trembling. "I said those things to the generals because they were looking for a reason to kill you," he whispered, his eyes searching hers with a desperate honesty. "They wanted to execute the outsider to appease the ancestors. I had to make them believe you were a military necessity to keep them from sliding a blade between your ribs while you slept." Alara froze. The logic of the pack, the brutal, cold calculations of survival, suddenly clicked. He hadn't been planning to use her. He had been lying to his own people to protect her life. "I didn't choose the mark, Alara," Silas said, his voice dropping to a rasp that only she could hear over the screams of the dying. "But I choose you. Not as a shield, not as a Luna, but as the only person who makes me want to be a man instead of a monster." He reached out, his thumb brushing the glowing thorns on her wrist. "Now, run, go to the tunnels. I'll hold them here." But the air didn't stay still. As Silas turned to face Cale's charge, the mark on Alara's arm began to vibrate with a frequency that made her teeth ache. The war drums outside weren't just the Silverpaws, they were the heartbeat of the mountain. The elders of the Shadow Crest, seeing Silas hesitate, began to chant from the high balconies. They were trying to force the relic's activation, and Alara was the conduit. The pain was sudden and blinding. The mark wasn't just glowing now. It was burning through her skin, reacting to the proximity of the enemy and the desperation of her protector. The silence that blanketed the courtyard was absolute, broken only by the crackle of dying torches and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the Star Wolf. Alara, encased in the shimmering silver form of a legend, looked upon the wreckage of the two packs. The hatred that had fueled the battle moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a primal, soul-deep recognition. The wolves of the Shadow Crest and the Silverpaw remained on their knees, not by choice, but because their very blood demanded submission to the creature standing before them. From the back of the Silverpaw ranks, an ancient elder named Valerius stepped forward. He was the oldest living wolf in the territories, a man whose memories predated the Great Schism. He didn't look at Alara with fear. He looked at her with a weeping, desperate hope. He walked past the fallen warriors and the stunned alphas, finally coming to a halt before the massive, starlight-furred wolf. "The mark," Valerius whispered, his voice trembling as he reached out a withered hand toward the glowing thorns etched into the fur of her foreleg. "It was never a mating bond for a single alpha. We were fools to believe the obsidian heart was merely a tool for the Shadow Crest." He turned to face the crowd, his voice gaining a sudden, haunting strength. "The mark doesn't bind her to Silas, nor does it belong to the Silverpaws. It binds her to the origin, to the dormant bloodline of the first matriarch, thought to have been purged in the fires of the Great War. She is not a prize to be claimed. She is the sovereign we abandoned 1,000 years ago." The revelation rippled through the courtyard like a physical blow. The elders of the Shadow Crest grew pale, realizing their outsider was, in fact, the source of their own sacred relic's power. She was the key to pack dominance, but not as a pawn, as the queen. Kale, the war leader of the Silverpaw, was the first to act. He didn't look at Sela's, and he didn't look at his own retreating vanguard. He dragged himself forward on his hands and knees, pressing his forehead against the cool, glowing earth at Alara's paws. The man who had come to rescue her as a possession now bowed to her as a subject. "The bloodline has returned," Kale rasped, his voice thick with a reverence that silenced the wind. "Luna." Silas stood a few feet away, his wolf form slowly receding as he shifted back into his human skin. He stood naked and scarred in the moonlight, looking at the woman he had tried to protect, then at the goddess she had become. The shock in his golden eyes was eclipsed by a profound, heartbreaking realization, and every alpha in the territories would soon come to claim her crown because power like hers never stays uncontested. Alara's obsidian eyes met Silas's one last time. She looked down at her glowing mark, the thorns now shimmering with a permanent, celestial light. The war was over, but her life as a girl was gone forever.
If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Don't forget to leave a comment and tell us what you think about the story. We love hearing from you. Your support helps keep this channel alive and bringing you amazing, interesting, and powerful alpha stories. Thank you for being here.